Triggers come from trauma. I think it's very interesting because Dr. Gottfield says that trauma is the #1 disruptor of hormones. Childhood adverse experiences can lead to an increase of mental health challenges as an adult. So those adverse childhood experiences, those feelings don't just go away. So triggers are basically what I talked about in the beginning. It's larger reactions that match the situation. It could be also intrusive memories that create the same physical experience that what we had during that time. Because it's not really what happens to us that is the trauma and the trigger, but it's what we make it mean. Have you ever had something happen and you have a reaction that is super inflated, and when you look back, you're like, wow, that was a really inflated reaction? Me too. And you were probably triggered. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're talking about our triggers and having our triggers become our training. So it's interesting, triggers come from trauma. And let's define trauma. Trauma is the lack of ability to cope into a situation so that it negatively affects our brain and our lives moving forward. So traumas are very interesting because there's like the big T traumas and the little t traumas. And it's very interesting because traumas are a very overwhelming experience and they differ per person. Like one person could be very traumatized by an event, and the same event could not cause trauma to another person. And we'll talk about that in more detail. I think it's very interesting because Dr. Gottfield says that trauma is the #1 disruptor of hormones. So it not only disrupts our hormones, it affects our immune system, it affects our minds, it affects our relationships, and our ability to move forward in different ways. And that's what we're talking about. So first of all, traumas, triggers, all of those things, it's part of the human experience, and we all have them. And unfortunately, that's part of being human. The little t traumas, which are like more, the big T traumas are more like a car accident or a rape or something that is very dramatic. The interesting thing and sometimes the more challenging things are the little t traumas. So the little t traumas are the ones that are not so obvious, and so it makes them harder to define. That was what really affected my life when I was in a domestic abuse marriage for 22 years. Just the constant messages and the constant you're not enough, and I, get ignored if I tried to bring up conflict, really made me struggle as far as the little t traumas, and really did affect me. And that was, again, what part of my story that led me to the psych ward and part of my journey. And you can hear all about it in the first 8 episodes. So let's talk about another story about little t traumas. And as you know, I'm a life coach and a hypnotherapist. And so in hypnotherapy, it's really interesting to see how those little t traumas or those little t things manifest in our lives. For example, if I had a client, Christy, and she's like, I want a better relationship with my sister Amy, but I'm really struggling with it. So we work through it on the cognitive side, the life coaching side, and then I do hypnotherapy. And again, hypnotherapy just allows us to relax and go a little bit more internal and be more suggestible, but we can go more internal and remember the things that led us to believe certain thoughts. And so during hypnotherapy, we find out that when she was in junior high, her mom automatically asked Amy, like, how's your day? But she didn't do that with Christy in junior high because Christy was going through a hard time and she didn't want to make it worse. And she knew that Christy liked to process more quietly and she was more of a journaler. But what Christy did is she came up with this belief that she wasn't as important as her sister, or her sister was more loved. And then she found evidence for that throughout the rest of her growing up time, and that is what was inhibiting her relationship with her sister. And so it's very interesting because it doesn't have to be this huge thing. It's just a belief that happens that negatively is affecting, like in Christy's case, moving forward with what she wants, and she wants a closer relationship with her sister Amy. So that's a really interesting thing of how those little t traumas can affect how we want to move forward. So it's really about real or perceived threats on our body. And a lot of it has to do with like energy and emotions that get locked in our body. And it can be very challenging. They really find out that childhood adverse experiences can lead to an increase of mental health challenges as an adult. So those adverse childhood experiences, those feelings don't just go away. And so doing that preventative medicine and working through those childhood traumas is so important because they come up at some point. It's just a matter of when. For example, my really good friend Erica, I knew her and her husband and they, had a great relationship, and then she had a baby, a son, and that was their first child together, and it totally triggered her husband, who had a lot of adverse childhood experience, and before you know it, he was getting more angry, more controlling, got into drugs, and it actually got so bad that it became life-threatening, and the cops were involved, and he tried to off her, and he's in prison now. But a lot of that was unprocessed childhood experiences that just capitulated after the birth of their son. So it's very wise of us to work on our adverse childhood experiences and our traumas, whether that's big T trauma or little t traumas. Are you a chronic people pleaser? Do you overgive, overfunction, pretty kind, and you're just tired, or maybe even a little bit resentful? Or are you wondering, wow, is this all to life? Is this how it works? Because I kind of feel like I'm going through the motions. Well, that's what the Unravel Notebook is for. It's 61 days to unravel our thinking, beliefs, and live a life intentionally as we connect closer with God, ourselves, and others, so we can be more confident and live brighter in this world. So triggers are basically what I talked about in the beginning. It's larger reactions than match the situation. It could be also intrusive memories that create the same physical experience that what we had during that time. And it affects our bodies. And it's so interesting how energy is stored in our body and emotions. And so, for me, I didn't process anger with my destructive marriage that I had previously. And so what I was getting was a lot of neck pain and shoulder pain, and I didn't connect that was related, those physical pains. And anger was a forbidden emotion back then, so I never really got to feel that feeling and process it. Then I read the book The Mind Body Prescription by Dr. Starno, and that was about 2 years ago, and it really made that connection. It explained what I needed to do, so I just processed that emotion of anger, and my chronic neck and shoulder pain that I'd probably had, for as long as I can remember, went away. And so it's very interesting how those emotions and those little t traumas and how they affect our bodies. Very interesting. But really, I think it's important that we see triggers as an opportunity for growth, because they're telling us where we still need to work on ourselves and our souls and our internal selves. I think it really needs to start with this idea that things happen. We can either have the victim mentality that things happen to us, and they do, but there's also a thought that could be very helpful that things happen for us. And that means that anything that happens, any challenging thing, God has no desire to waste additional pain or to have you redo the pain over and over. And there can be healing involved. And so when we have this idea that things happen for us and that our biggest challenges actually can become our passions or where our healing needs to be, it's a different outlook and a way different way to look at things. Because it's not really what happens to us that is the trauma and the trigger, but it's what we make it mean, which is so interesting. For example, I love the story about Manuba Mazari from Pakistan. She was in a car crash at 21 where she was paraplegic. She basically couldn't walk. She can't walk. And she was in bed for 2 years. And she felt like her life was over. She couldn't have kids, and kids was really important to her. And so she went through the feeling of the pain, the processing, and, the challenge of that. And then she decided it was going to be her rebirth. And she decided to use her experience differently and to look at it in a different way. And she decided to use her experience to inspire others. So she became a great singer, a news anchor, an artist, and a mom. She adopted a child. And this was all in her wheelchair and became a huge inspiration and still is a huge inspiration for others. But the facts of the matter is, yes, she had a car crash at 21 and it caused paralysis and completely changed her life. That could have made her bitter and downcast and just awful the rest of her life. But what she made that mean and how she transformed that, she actually became an inspiration. So that's what we're talking about, is just the processing and then redoing our stories and redoing it in a way that actually serves us. So what do we do with our traumas? What do we do with our triggers? Let me give you some ideas. Well, when you have a severe trauma, and I would say, like, if you go back and think about it and you're like triggered to like an 8, 9, or 10, like really triggered, really, really feel it, it's very important to see a specialist, a therapist. I would absolutely encourage EMDR. And again, that's eye movement desensitization. I can't remember what the R stands for, but it's a much quicker way. You're not having to like necessarily live the experience again and talk about it a ton. It's actually a very rapid way of going back and like reprocessing that through a special technique. And certain specialists, certain counselors are trained in EMDR, and that was super helpful. I definitely did that. It was very dramatically helpful for me. I also talk a lot about the BARF process, and that I talk about in my book, the Unravel Notebook, available on Amazon. And basically, the BARF practice is a practice of barfing up how you feel, like just write it out, all messy, exactly how you feel. And once you barf it, you sort it and you deal with it. And it's just a system of processing through traumas and through triggers that helps you redo it. And really the big thing with that, and anytime we do that, is after we barf it and feel it, we really have to look at our experiences with kindness and curiosity. And remember, our emotions are information. There's not necessarily bad or good emotions for the most part. It's information, and we need to honor that, and we need to honor our feelings. That doesn't mean we live by our feelings and react by our feelings. We actually need to process it and choose and decide what we need to do with it. But the reactions is never very helpful if it's just a reaction. So see a specialist, the BARF process. In the moment, you can do a breathing technique, which actually helps calm the vagus nerve. And that's, again, you breathing in for 4 seconds, holding for 2 seconds, and breathing out slowly for 8 seconds. And I used this a ton when I started dating my husband, because I was triggered all over the place, because I came out of 22 years of, a domestic abuse situation, and I was triggered all the time. And I could do this breathing technique anytime I was triggered, and it wasn't very noticeable. One time he asked me, he's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm just breathing." But the truth is, I was radically triggered, and I could have reacted in that moment, or I could take it and process it and decide how I wanted to proceed. So that's what I used a lot. It came up all the time. Another one is just making sure you pause and leave the situation if it's like a 5, and leave the conversation temporarily. If you're feeling like a 5 or a 10 on the emotion scale out of 0 to 10, it's not going to serve anyone or the experience if we're at that stage, because it's very hard to think in a conflict resolution way or actually hear each other. So it doesn't serve us. But it's so important that we do go back and we actually deal with the conflict or deal with those situations. And the last thing is life coaching and hypnotherapy. And that's why I do it and I'm passionate about it, is because as a life coach, we deal with the cognitive side and we work through it. But then in hypnotherapy, we can get into the subconscious and figure out the part that decided to come up with this, belief or this story that's no longer serving us, and we can change that. And that's why I do that and help people in that way. So let's just end with taking a deep breath in. As you take a deep breath in, make sure your belly is expanding out, and then holding it, and then breathing out slowly. And one more time, take a deep breath in, and then hold it, and breathe out slowly. And if there was a memory that came up during this episode, I really encourage you to decide when you're going to take 10 minutes out to process this, do the BARF process, or choose to schedule time with a therapist. And you can always go to betterhelp.com and work through that, because we are more than our traumas, and we can choose to let our triggers show us our training areas. And that's so important. So that is our journey. So live brighter 1% at a time, and I believe in you. Make it a great day. Stay tuned for our next episode.